this? Well, apparently Rob Brant versus Jeff Horn is being discussed. Rob Brant, the WBA secondary world title holder at middleweight, could be headed to Australia for his second title defense. As ESPN reports, there have been discussions with Top Rank about Brant facing Jeff Horn. Brant won the belt last October, dominating Ryota Murata in what was considered by most to be a pretty big upset. The 28-year-old Minnesota native returned to his home state on February 15th, making a successful title defense against Kasan Beisangurov, stopping Beisangurov in the 11th round. Well, let's put it this way, ladies and germs. If they make the decision to stage a fight between Jeff Horn and Rob Brant, needless to say, Jeff Horn would be taco meat. Taco meat, that's what he would be. Understand that while Jeff Horn might be coming off a big win, a big domestic win, I should say, over Anthony Mundine, beating Anthony Mundine, even in spectacular fashion, does not offer an insight, a window into how Jeff Horn will fare against the upper crust of the middleweight division. And I'm not saying this to disparage Jeff Horn. I'm not just trying to, just berate him just for the sake of berating him. No. Rob Brant is very much
a risky fight.
A dangerous fight for Jeff Horn. A dangerous fight that is a needless risk. That, if you're going to take on those kinds of risks against a guy, at least let it be for a full version of a world title. Or at least let it be against a marquee fighter of considerable value so that you're compensated for the risk you're taking and the beating that you might take as a result of that risk. Now, Rob Brant, as well as he's doing for himself, he's none of those things. He offers none of those things. Rob Brant is not a big payday.
He's not.
And he's not even a full champion. He's holding a baby belt, a baby version of the WBA title. For the risks that Jeff Horn would be taking against Rob Brant, you might as well sign up to fight Canelo. I mean, I wouldn't give Jeff good odds to win either of those fights, but at least with Canelo, you'd make substantially more money than what you'd be making
with Rob Brant.
Risking it all against Rob Brant. And this is yet another chapter in the unique set of challenges that Jeff Horn faces, it being that given his particular set of physical dimensions, he's actually more adequately suited to fight as a welterweight, but he's struggling to make welterweight, in which case what his body would require him to do is move up to junior middleweight or middleweight, and therein lies the dilemma. Given his particular set of physical dimensions, he'd be a particularly small fry at either junior middleweight
or middleweight.
He's really not cut out for those weight classes, not in terms of physical dimensions, size, or punching power. In those weight classes, he'd very much be a fish out of water. But because he's struggling so much to make welterweight, he's got no choice but to go upstairs, and that really limits the pool of options that are out there to where you can put Jeff in an interesting fight that is also a winnable fight. I'll tell you that a Rob Brant doesn't seem like a Rob Brant fight does not seem like a winnable fight to me for Jeff Horn. It just doesn't. This is a guy that's gaining momentum. This is a guy that's becoming more and more a put-together fighter. This is a guy that could give Jeff Horn a career-altering beating. In which case, you have to ask, why even put Jeff in that situation when, even if he wins, he's not winning much? I mean, what would he be winning as a result of that fight? A baby belt? It's certainly not a big payday, so you really got to wonder that while the reports might say that this fight is being discussed, just how likely is it to come off? I mean, are Jeff Horn's handlers seriously considering putting him in there with Rob Brant, given that they don't even stand to gain much for the risk they'd be taking? To be completely honest, the ideal scenario for both of these fighters is for them to face other people. The ideal scenario for Rob Brant is to go out there and face a Jermall Charlo, a Canelo Alvarez, a Demetrius Andrade, those kinds of guys. That's the ideal scenario for a Rob Brant because he's already established himself as one of the guys that grace the upper crust of the middleweight division. In that way, there are better names out there for him to fight than Jeff Horn. I mean, for Christ's sake, I'd rather see Rob Brant versus David Lemieux. That would make more sense to me than Rob Brant versus Jeff Horn, in which case, for Jeff Horn,
what makes sense?
The fight that would make the most sense for him would have to be a Kell Brook fight, but therein lies a dilemma. Kell Brook is rumored to be facing Jesse Vargas very soon, so what Jeff could do is bide his time at junior middleweight, you fight a couple of domestic guys, and see if you can get the winner of that fight. But what you don't do is go to middleweight and risk it all against Rob Brant for a baby belt. That just doesn't make any kind of sense at all. You're not going to be compensated for that kind of risk monetarily. Rob Brant does not represent a big payday. He is not a big name and he's not a big marquee fighter. So the money, as far as being compensated money-wise, that's not there. Now, as far as a world title, he's not really holding a full version of a world title. So you're coming up short in that area too. For Jeff Horn, he's got to navigate very carefully what he does next. And I'll tell you that a Rob Brant fight spells disaster. That's just my opinion. Feel free to disagree. And in other news, newly crowned IBF Junior Middleweight Champion Marie-Eve Dicaire is scheduled to be heading back to the ring in less than a month. On March 23rd, she's going to be defending that world title against an opponent that has yet to be announced. This is all on the heels of the news that
the other two champions,
WBA champion Hannah Gabriels, may be squaring off against WBC champion Eva Pietrzkowska here stateside. And it seems to me that Marie-Eve Dicaire and her handlers really have the right idea. It behooves her that while the other two champions are looking to square off against each other, she pile up even more professional experience. She rack up a couple of title defenses.
Keep busy.
Keep the machine well-oiled and keep the tools sharp. It makes absolutely no sense for her being a newly crowned champion and still being in the early stages of her career. It makes absolutely no sense now that she's a world champion to take her foot off the gas. If anything, she's got to put the pedal to the metal and rack up more professional experience, because as it stands,
there's competition out there.
She's got some stiff competition in her weight class. And now that she's effectively painted a target on her back by procuring a world title, it behooves her to stay ready. It behooves her to stay sharp. That before she even walks into another high-level situation with a champion, she needs to rack up title defenses. She needs to do what she's got to do to become an even more put-together fighter. Understand that Marie-Eve Dicaire has all the makings of what could be a sensation, but she's still in the early stages of her career. She's still in the early phases, and in that way, she could use these little keep-busy fights to further hone her craft.
And perfect.
You know, that Marie-Eve Dicaire is not the kind of fighter that's relying on physical attributes to get the job done. For what it's worth, she's not the biggest puncher, you know. She's yet to score a knockout as a professional, but what she is a very skilled boxer. She's your finesse fighter. She's your hit and not get hit kind of fighter, and it behooves that kind of fighter to put those skills to use often.
Stay loose.
Because physical attributes alone, you know, they're not necessarily going to be there to avail you in the absence of your skills. So it behooves her to participate in just these kinds of situations. Now, given that the opponent has yet to be announced, one can deduce that whoever it is, it's likely not a high-profile name, likely not a live animal, so much as a body to put in the ring with Marie so that she can keep the tools sharp. One can make that inference given that, you know, it's less than a month away and we don't even know who she's going to be fighting. But that's okay, because one, Marie-Eve Dicaire did face a live champion. Not just a live animal, but a live champion. Understand, there are many ways to procure a world title in the sport of boxing. You can square off against a contender for a vacant title, or you could be squaring off against a newly crowned champion, somebody who doesn't have that much experience, whereas Marie-Eve Dicaire unseated Chris Namis, someone who's not only experienced, been in there with a lot of people, but she didn't just win that title yesterday, you understand. So Marie-Eve Dicaire definitely earned her stripes. And because of that, I'm not overly critical over who she's going to be fighting next.
I give her a pass.
So long as she's keeping busy, so long as she's staying active, that's really what's important. Because Marie ain't got that many fights anyway. What is she, 14-0? But she's 14-0, but she managed to become a world champion. So there's room to cut the girl some slack in the event that her next opponent isn't highly touted or highly rated. Whatever the case is, I've got no complaints. I look forward to seeing her on March 23rd in what will be her first title defense. And in other news, newly crowned WBC champion Anthony Direll was quoted as saying he wants Caleb Plant and he'd be willing to fight David Benavidez too. These statements were coming post-fight after his victory over Avni Yildirim for what was the vacant WBC title, the title that David Benavidez still has a legitimate claim to. Now, on one end, you could say that since all of those guys that he mentioned are on the same side of the street that he is, that should make any one of those fights feasible, that those should be relatively simple fights to make because they're on the same side of the street. They basically fight under the same banner.
The PBC banner.
So, relatively speaking, there shouldn't be any problems. But, you know, I'm really not holding my breath for any of those fights. I'm really not. And here's why. You know, when it comes to the PBC, when it comes to them, guys that are on their same side of the street, just because they're on the same side of the street or they might fight on the same network doesn't necessarily mean the fight will come off in a timely fashion. I know that some people out there might not like the sound of that, but it's the truth. When it comes to the PBC, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the fights will come off in a timely fashion. Now, for other outfits like Matchroom, other outfits like Queensberry Promotions, other outfits like Top Rank, when they've got a bunch of guys on the same side of the street, you can almost guarantee that the fights will get made in a timely fashion. But the same is not true when it comes to the PBC, and there are several examples of this. You know, look at Charles Martin, for example. Charles Martin, PBC guy. He won the IBF title. People had mixed feelings about how he won it. They didn't think very highly of him. But at the end of the day, he was a PBC guy. And you could argue that a fight between him and Deontay Wilder really should have been the next step. And yet, Anthony Joshua beat Deontay Wilder to the punch. He managed to get Charles Martin in the ring first. Whereas, it should have been Wilder. That should have been Wilder's first attempt at unifying a title since becoming a champion.
But it wasn't.
That really didn't happen. Now, for those of you out there that are thinking, oh, well, that's neither here nor there, here's another example. Gary Russell and Leo Santa Cruz. Two guys that really should have fought a long time ago. Gary Russell's been fighting once a year for the past 4 years.
Jesus.
And where we should have seen a Gary Russell versus Leo Santa Cruz fight already, instead what we got was Leo Santa Cruz versus Abner Mares again. Then some other guy and probably some other guy. And these are guys that have been on the same side of the street, yet that fight really hasn't come off yet. We don't know that it's going to come off. I mean, we see that there are preliminary talks about the fight, but are they actually in negotiations? Are the wheels actually in motion for those two guys that are on the same side of the street to fight each other? This is what I mean. Just because those two guys are on the same side of the street, David Benavidez, Caleb Plant, just because they're on the same side of the street as Anthony Direll doesn't mean we're close to seeing that fight.
I wish we were.
Those fights, rather. Yet another example of this exists in the junior middleweight division. You know, Jarrett Hurd, he had an injury and he overcame that injury, had his maiden fight since that injury. But now the talks seem to be shifting towards a Jarrett Hurd versus Julian Williams fight when really it should be Jarrett Hurd versus Tony Harrison or something like that. But no, that's not the case. What we're looking at is Jarrett Hurd versus Julian Williams and Jermell Charlo versus Tony Harrison, the rematch. That's what we're looking at. And that way you can see that when it comes to the PBC, guys being on the same side of the street doesn't guarantee that you're going to see that fight anywhere in the near future. I mean, look, Errol Spence has been on the same side of the street as any variety of top 10 welterweights, yet he hasn't fought Keith Thurman yet because Keith really don't want to. Sean Porter, he seems to have other plans. He's fighting Ugas. Danny Garcia, who knows what the fuck he's going to do next aside from fighting Granados. After that, what does he intend to do? Spence has been on the same side of the street with those guys for years, but he hasn't fought any of them, so same applies. That just because those guys are on the same side of the street doesn't mean you're going to get that fight in a timely fashion. Now, I respect Anthony Direll's enthusiasm. It's nice to hear that a fighter wants to unify with another champion, that, okay, now I'm a champion, I want to fight another champion. I would love to see Anthony Direll fight Caleb Plant in a unification fight, but I'm not holding my breath for that to happen. What might come before that is a David Benavidez fight, because David Benavidez does have a legitimate claim to that WBC title. The WBC went easy on him after he got caught sniffing coke, and they said, okay, you go into this rehab, we'll give you, a title shot when you get the chance, whenever you want it, whatever. The point is that we might end up seeing that before we see any titles unified. It's possible.
It is.
You just gotta look at how the whole thing breaks down, that while David Benavidez might have a legitimate claim towards Anthony Direll's newly obtained WBC title, guess what? David Benavidez has already got a dance partner. He's gonna be fighting Jay Leon Love in March. You look over at Caleb Plant, and Caleb Plant's name's been tied to Mike Lee. They might be fighting each other very soon, in which case, while those things are going on, Anthony Direll may decide to keep busy with someone else, putting a fight with either of those guys 2 to 3 fights from now. It could happen that way. I mean, if it didn't, and we saw Caleb Plant fighting Anthony Direll next, well, that would be great. That would be ideal. It's just that given the PBC's reputation for extenuating
prolonging
time periods for fights, longer than they need to, I'm not holding my breath. The reason they do this is because they're trying to replicate the Mayweather formula as many times as they can. It's for this reason that they prolong fights as long as they do, even though it's not necessary.
It really is.
But that's the rhyme and the reason behind that, you understand. They're trying to replicate the Mayweather versus Pacquiao formula. Thus, they want to get the best crowd reaction they can, so they end up stalling out fights that really don't need to be stalled out. Not every fight is the equivalent of Mayweather versus Pacquiao. Thus, the application of that formula just becomes annoying. Like, what are you going to try to do? You're going to try to marinate every single in-house fight you've got?
Come on.
I'll tell you what I think, and I could be wrong, but I'll tell you what I think. I think that if David Benavidez beats Jay Leon Love, we're likely to see him fight Anthony Direll next.
Okay.
Then, given all David Benavidez's choice words about Caleb Plant, what might happen is, okay, we see David Benavidez fight Anthony Direll, maybe he beats him, then he has another interim fight, then maybe after that, if Caleb Plant is still the IBF champion, then maybe we get that fight, maybe. But we're looking at 2 to 3 fights, maybe more. That's what we're looking at, because what we know with an absolute certitude right now is that David Benavidez is going to be fighting Jay Leon Love next, and Caleb Plant's name's been tied to Mike Lee.
For his next fight.
And in the time that those fights are going on, I don't think that Anthony Direll's just going to sit on his hands. I think that we may see him one more time in between that time. Then after all of that is done, the smoke clears, maybe we see a Benavidez versus Direll fight. Maybe we see that. Then maybe 1 or 2 interim fights, and then afterwards, if Caleb Plant is still the IBF champion, then maybe we see a unification fight. Maybe, you know. This is essentially what I'm getting at. That before this thing becomes a unification situation, we might see 1 or 2, maybe 3 fights before it becomes that. So while Anthony Direll may be maintaining his enthusiasm, saying that he is willing to face those fighters, I don't doubt that he's willing to face those fighters. What I do doubt is that the bigwigs are going to orchestrate that kind of a situation. That's what I'm in doubt about. It's just not characteristic of the PBC to orchestrate those kinds of situations in a timely fashion. So in spite of what Anthony Direll is saying, I'm really not holding my breath to see those fights anytime soon. I'm just not.